On the morning of June 11, 2025, the USS Roosevelt, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer, was conducting a routine freedom of navigation patrol in the Baltic Sea. The mission was standard: assert the right to sail through international waters near the Kaliningrad enclave, a heavily fortified Russian military zone. The Roosevelt had done this route before, but this time, it wasn't routine. At 08:42 local time, the destroyer's radar picked up fast-moving contacts approaching from the northeast. Two Russian Su-30 SM fighters had taken off from the Chkalovsk Air Base in Kaliningrad just 10 minutes earlier. Their transponders were off, no radio contact. They were flying fast, below 500 feet, hugging the sea surface at over 550 knots. The ship's Combat Information Center went into immediate action. Rules of engagement required the crew to track but not engage unless the aircraft posed a direct threat. A detachment of sailors moved to standby positions. The Phalanx close-in weapon system was placed on warm standby, ready to fire at a moment's notice. As the jets got closer, the Roosevelt's electronic warfare team activated passive sensors. The fighters weren't just flying blind, they were jamming. Narrowband electronic interference started to affect the ship's Link 16 data feed. This wasn't a routine flyby, it was a probe. At 08:48, the two Su-30s made their first pass, just 100 feet above the ship's superstructure. The roar of their twin engines shook the bridge windows. Sailors on deck were momentarily stunned by the proximity. One of the jets banked hard over the bow, showing its underbelly. A KH-31 missile was clearly mounted under its wing, a weapon designed to kill ships. No one fired. But now, this was no longer just a game of intimidation. It was a threat display. Captain Jared Holmes, the Roosevelt's commanding officer, knew what was happening. The Russian pilots weren't acting alone. This was coordinated. A message from Moscow, likely tied to NATO's recent exercises in Poland. The Russian Ministry of Defense had warned of unwelcome provocations in the region just 3 days earlier. This was the response. The destroyer's radar picked up two more Su-30 aircraft entering the area, this time from the southeast. The Roosevelt was now boxed in from two directions. The new jets flew in tighter, circling the ship in overlapping orbits at low altitude. The Russian pilots still made no radio calls. Inside the Combat Information Center, the atmosphere shifted. US Navy protocol allowed for escalation under very specific conditions, but it had to be precise. Mistakes in these moments didn't just trigger headlines, they triggered crises. 2 minutes later, one of the Su-30s performed a high-speed loop around the ship's stern, diving to just 75 feet above sea level. The turbulence from the jet created a spray of seawater that reached the flight deck. It was dangerous flying, risky even for skilled pilots, but it served its purpose, to show the US crew that the Russians were willing to escalate. What the Russian pilots didn't know was that the Roosevelt wasn't alone. 130 nautical miles west, a US Air Force KC-135 stratotanker had been orbiting for the past 2 hours. Alongside it, two F-15EX Eagles had been flying silent escort. They weren't on radar. They weren't broadcasting. But they were watching everything. The moment the Roosevelt's radar began feeding high-speed contact data, those F-15s changed direction. Back aboard the Roosevelt, the ship's intelligence officer received a real-time uplink. High-altitude drone surveillance showed increased radio traffic between Kaliningrad's command post and the Russian Western Military District. Something bigger might be coming. At 8:58, things escalated further. One of the Russian jets banked directly over the destroyer's bridge and performed a simulated attack run. No ordnance was released, but the radar lock warning activated in the Roosevelt's combat systems. That crossed a line. Captain Holmes ordered the ship's SLQ-32 electronic warfare suite into active jamming mode. The Roosevelt began disrupting the Su-30's targeting radar. In return, one of the Russian pilots fired a radar decoy flare. It was a clear signal. This was becoming a live-fire scenario in everything but name. At 9:03, the Roosevelt's Combat Air Patrol arrived. The two F-15EX fighters came in from high altitude, descending rapidly toward the engagement zone. Their AESA radars lit up the Russian jets from 30 miles out. Targeting systems locked, not to fire, but to let the Russian pilots know they were now being watched from above. The Russian formation scattered. One Su-30 banked east toward Kaliningrad. The others pulled into defensive maneuvers, climbing and activating their own radar systems. The standoff had turned into a silent showdown between two generations of combat aircraft, one side flying bold, low, and aggressive, the other staying silent, calculated, and dominant from altitude. The U.S. pilots held position just outside weapons release range. They didn't need to shoot. Their presence alone forced the Russians to break off. At 9:08, Russian communications lit up. A short coded burst from Kaliningrad Air Defense Command ordered all aircraft to return to base. The fighters peeled off one by one. The final Su-30 vanished from radar at 0914, but the Roosevelt didn't relax. Less than 45 minutes after the Russian jets disappeared from radar, a new contact appeared, this time coming from the west at high altitude. It was a drone, not one of theirs. A U.S. MQ-9 Reaper had been redirected from a nearby NATO base in Germany and was now flying a wide loop around the Roosevelt's position, providing overhead intelligence. But it wasn't alone in the air. At 10:22 a.m., the ship's SPY-1D radar detected a small, slow-moving object entering its surveillance range from the southwest, barely above wave level. It wasn't transponding. Its flight pattern didn't match commercial or NATO drones. Moments later, a second object appeared, flying roughly 200 meters behind the first. The Roosevelt's electronic warfare officer confirmed they were likely Russian Orlan-10 surveillance drones, frequently used for battlefield reconnaissance and targeting data in Ukraine. They were small, wingspan just over 3 meters, but capable of transmitting real-time video and GPS coordinates back to command posts. These drones weren't heading to a battlefield. They were flying directly toward a U.S. Navy destroyer. Captain Holmes wasted no time. With permission granted, the ship's deck crew activated the Mark 38 25mm autocannon. The forward drone crossed within 1,800 meters. A short burst of tracer fire lit the sky. The drone exploded mid-air, showering debris into the sea. The second drone tried to climb, but was picked up by the Roosevelt's rolling airframe missile system. A single ram launch later, it vanished from the radar screen. At the same time, sonar teams aboard the Roosevelt received concerning data from their towed array. A low-frequency contact had been picked up west of their position, consistent with a diesel-electric submarine surfacing briefly, likely to raise a communications mast or periscope. It was a Russian Kilo-class submarine. The Roosevelt immediately launched its MH-60R Seahawk helicopter, which deployed sonobuoys in a tight pattern across a 15-kilometer radius. The helicopter circled in search mode while the destroyer slowed to sonar sweep speed. No further contact was made. The Kilo had already slipped away, likely diving deep and retreating toward Kaliningrad waters. But its presence confirmed what many aboard already suspected. The Russian flyovers were just one part of a larger coordinated operation. The buzzing was the distraction. And somewhere inside a Russian command room, someone was reviewing the footage and realizing just how far the U.S. Navy's networked response capabilities had advanced. Every move the Russians made was met, matched, and countered, without a single U.S. weapon being fired in aggression. If you want to see more real-world military encounters and how these tense moments actually unfold, make sure to subscribe to our channel.